Principals lead by their own knowledge, and so what we're hopeful for is that principals have enough knowledge of the current empirically valid research so that they can talk in an informed way with their teachers and be able to keep the dialogue going rather than just having a brief, check-up about what's happening in the classroom, that they can actually monitor what teachers are doing because they're interested in the welfare of students and are able to help teachers lead on with their teaching and to also support them really as being an envoy into helping them take on new knowledge that's coming out as well from the field, because the teaching of reading is an emerging field in terms of the research and new knowledge comes along all the time. So principals as literacy leaders are there as one of the range of access points for teachers to be able to really envoy that information in. Really the primary aspect of the Big Six, I think, is oral language, because I describe it as an underpinning of everything that students do, but it's also the umbrella, because the listening and speaking component is so much entwined in all aspects of literacy, and what students speak is what they actually read and what they write. Now, we're very, very reliant on parents to get children off to a good start, and we would encourage parents as much as possible to talk with their children and to get that talk sustained, because the research tells us quite clearly that if talk is short, it tends to be just procedural, that is, it's directions, like do this, do that, and so on. But the longer we talk with our children and the longer teachers talk with their children, the more rich the conversation becomes, because there is elaboration that takes place. Now, we also know from researchers such as Hart and Risley, that very important research they did some years ago, where they talked about, even by the age of 3, children have quite different amounts of word knowledge because of the amount of talk that they have engaged in with family and wider community. And those children who are advantaged are the ones who have that broader vocabulary. What we also know is that in schools, it's not that many students who have articulation difficulties, which is one that's more easily picked up. That is, it's quite straightforward to pick up on a student who has wabbits running around the river. But potentially, or statistically, that's not that many students in a school, though it may seem a lot if they're in your class. But the major number of students are those who have listening and speaking difficulties. That is, students who struggle to maintain an attentive style for listening, and students who, when asked to respond or to initiate conversations, are somewhat taciturn, are somewhat hesitant, don't have the words to call upon, and certainly are struggling on occasions to keep a conversation going in a coherent way with a listener. Now, that feeds directly into the learning of reading, because particularly when reading narrative texts, there's a lot of conversation in narrative texts that students are needing to read, but it's also very important in the place of reading information texts because of that link with vocabulary that we'll come to at a later point, but that significance of being able to speak words, know what words mean, and so on. When principals are talking with their teachers, they need to be very mindful of reminding teachers, if it's not familiar to them, that many of the children coming to school are coming from a background where English is not their first language. And we need to dignify that first language and acknowledge the importance of it, whilst helping students to develop their abilities to use the English language in school, which is the primary medium of information. A couple of other things that we find are very important across all students in any school in Australia is we must be reassured that their hearing and vision have been checked recently, and as is needed, if it isn't what it should be, that it actually is being attended to. Because in the Big Six there is a huge reliance on students being able to see and to be able to hear. And if students have compromised hearing and vision difficulties, then that's going to put them right behind straight away in terms of being able to access the curriculum like other students where that is not an issue. What we also find with many of these students with listening and speaking is that Principals need to remind teachers that listening and speaking needs to be programmed like every other aspect of the English curriculum. But of course, with listening and speaking, it goes cross-curricular as well. It's there in every learning area. What we know from the research is that just getting students to do pre-prepared talks, or what we would know in the primary years perhaps as morning talks or show and tell, is insufficient. Certainly it can help students to have a little bit of confidence to talk in front of their peers about recounts of what they've done and items to show, but that is not the development of listening and speaking. And we cannot really assume that students' listening and speaking skills will naturally develop with a birthday, will naturally develop by standing next to someone who is a good speaker, that for some students they need very specific and even more sustained and explicit instruction and guidance in the development of their listening and speaking skills. And so we differentiate accordingly. So just moving on from the importance of oral language and listening and speaking, the next one of the big six that just ties in very importantly is the place of phonological awareness. Now, phonological awareness is everybody's, students' abilities to be able to identify by isolating the sounds in words. So I always refer teachers to the concept of a telephone. Think phoneme, think phones, think phonological awareness. Phonological awareness is a student's abilities to manipulate, isolate, blend, segment sounds in words. And it helps them have a heightened awareness about how the English language is composed. And for some students that comes really quite automatically, and for some of them really with no teaching. There's another proportion of students who need a bit of instruction in phonological awareness, but then get it and really fly very quickly. But there's also a significant proportion of students in schools who will only learn what they are quite specifically taught. And this ties in with assessment that we'll have a look at a later point. But we need to be very clear about who needs to have really very structured, systematic instruction in phonological awareness, because the research tells us, again, tied in with oral language, is an underpinning and overarching skill. Certainly we have seen through the research for a number of decades that students who don't have a robust phonological awareness are held back in their acquisition of reading and writing and spelling, because it's all tied in together. And so without this kind of instruction, they are left floundering because they don't have that ability to be able to self-manage. Because what we're looking at is to try and help students become more autonomous learners. We don't want them tied to teachers. And so what principals are encouraging teachers to do is to help students develop their phonological awareness by finding out right from the start of school what they already know, and then getting in there fast to make sure that all the aspects of phonological awareness are taught and really bedded down very, very quickly as a way into the more sophisticated reading skills that are going to be developed. So as we think about what are the constituent parts of phonological awareness, I think it's very important for students to be taken into phonological awareness at the whole word level to start with, so that they understand what a word is, for us to then be able to show them how that word is composed auditorily. Otherwise, if we start at the micro level, they may not make sense of it. The major issues around phonological awareness that need to be taught are rhyming, alliteration, segmentation, blending, isolation, and manipulating, or sometimes called exchanging. And these components don't necessarily have to be taught in any sequential order, but certainly all need to be attended to develop the skills of a student so that they have that autonomous ability to be able to manipulate sounds in the English language. One of the other aspects that we also find with phonological awareness is that it doesn't need a lot of teaching materials to do. Generally, it's done auditorily, it's done with phoneme boxes and a few counters, but we don't need a high level of cash to teach phonological awareness. It's something that can be done quite simply. The other aspect I'd also like to just highlight is that there is some interplay between the words phonemic awareness and phonological awareness, and depending on what book you read, the words may be used interchangeably. But the general definitions go like this. Phonemic awareness includes those 6 components that I mentioned before, so rhyming, alliteration, segmentation, blending, isolation, and manipulating or exchanging. It becomes phonological awareness when you keep those 6, but you also add in the elements of syllabification and the development of students' abilities in terms of onset and rhyme. Now, they are more sophisticated skills and require even more rigour in terms of teaching because they look at chunks of words as opposed to those individual phonemes or sounds. Another aspect that's critically important that's included in the Big Six is that of vocabulary. Now again, that can be underestimated in terms of importance because we do sometimes work under the belief that as children develop, their vocab increases, but that's not necessarily the case. And again, part of the curriculum that teachers are needing to invoke, and principals therefore are assisting teachers to know how to do that, is to make sure that vocab is developed with all students. We know from the research again that students who have a very restricted vocabulary are held back from being able to be independent readers and writers because what students speak is what they read and what they write. What we also know is that students learn more words from being read to and reading than they do from talking with adults. Now, the reason for that is that when talking with adults, teachers in schools, principals and parents, generally those adults temper their language so that the children or the students understand what is being asked of them. And so new vocabulary is not generally introduced. So therefore, what we need to be mindful of is that when students are being read to, interesting new words are pointed out, described, chatted about, not necessarily in a formal way, but also that particular vocabulary words are actually taught because they're important for students to know. Now, just recently, the Oxford University Press did a whole raft of research across Australia looking at the words that children spontaneously choose to write in terms of free writing. And they mapped this writing sample collection across a range of schools in states that was inclusive of students in Indigenous communities, both rural and metropolitan, against different factors against the Australian Bureau of Statistics. Now that research is freely available on the Oxford University website, and very interesting is the interactive tool which allows principals and teachers to look at, for example, what were the most used words by Year 1 Indigenous students in remote schools? What was the most interesting raft of words written by 9-year-olds in metropolitan schools, and so on? Now those words aren't all necessarily thrilling words. I call them the glue words that hold the interesting words together, because many of them are words like were, with, was, which, because, that have no thrill on their own, but are absolutely essential for students to know automatically, to be able to read, because they appear in fiction and information texts constantly. And they are also the words that students will need to write, no matter what the learning area. In terms of helping students with vocabulary development, there's a range of resource materials around these days that can assist teachers in the kinds of approaches that they might use in a very strategic way for developing vocabulary development. I guess the one that's been most popular, because it really was a turning point in understanding the significance of vocabulary, is the one by Isabel Beck, McCowan and Kuchen, called Bringing Words to Life. But certainly there's many others that have come out in the last really 5 or 6 years that do somewhat similar to what those authors say, and certainly there needs to be a copy of one or more of those texts in the professional libraries at school. Now, another aspect of the Big Six that is significant and somewhat contested in the field by some is the issue of phonics. Now, when we look at the research around the teaching of phonics, it is undeniable that students must be taught this process as a mediated tool for being able to read words in the service of being able to read connected text. What we do know is that there has been some conflict about how that should be done. If we go back to the research, what we are being reminded of again and again really is that synthetic phonics, or really a systematic approach to phonics, is the way to go, because it's really taking the concept of not leaving it to chance. We are trying to help students have a way of self-managing when they come to words that they can't read, where they can literally go into automatic and think, okay, so how can I work this word out? Because what we do know is that context is wildly unpredictable and unsupportive in a range of reading of text. You really have to know how to read most of the words to be able to use context for the occasional word that you come across. But having a phonic base strengthens students' abilities to be able to manage without looking to someone else to be able to help them read those words. Again, and we'll come back to it again in a while, the issue of assessment is significant here to find out what they know and what they need to know next. We can't assume because of age and birthday that students have these actual skills. What we also know is that teachers need to use a developmental approach that is increasingly more complex. And so principals need to be ahead of this in terms of knowing this kind of information and where they might access the kinds of approaches that might be used for teaching phonics. It can't be ignored. It absolutely is essential that students are given this as part of their toolkit to be autonomous readers. When we look at comprehension, we have to be very careful here in terms of reminding ourselves that reading connected text does not come at the very end of having done everything I've spoken about before. It actually is an interplay all the time of all of the development of these strategies, or the Big Six, because we can't leave reading words till later. Now, comprehension of text is very, very significant in terms of what students bring to the reading of text. It has a lot to do with prior knowledge. And principals who know their school communities, along with the communities who help inform the principal's work, have particular contexts, particular interests, particular challenges and successes that inform what people do. Now, the reading material that students are given needs to have a way of being connected to students' lives, but also to help them make connections to lives they may and are yet to live. When we are checking students' comprehension, we can't just say to them, tell me what you read about. Principals need to be reminding teachers that the teaching of comprehension is about establishing processes for alerting students about how to get into reading a text, what to do while they are reading a text, and then how to think about and respond about what has been read. Another component that's particularly important in comprehension is getting that balance between the reading of fiction and information texts. There is way too much reading of fiction texts at the expense of information. And I hesitate to say, but I will, that life is non-fiction, and students learn more words from reading information text, so here's your link with vocabulary, than they may well do from reading narratives. So we need to get that balance there in what material is offered to students, and therefore what questions are asked of them, the kinds of questions that are asked of them. Principals also need to be helping teachers understand that yes, basic questions about content are important, but that is not the end of being a comprehender of an author's message. There needs to be that connection at the inference level and that connection at the personal level with the students about what they took from the reading of that text, what they learned, what they believe, what they think, and so on. So another of the Big Six that ties in with comprehension is that of fluency. Now, there are three components of fluency. there's rate, there's accuracy, and there's prosody. Now, rate, of course, is what it suggests, that students need to read in a fluid style at a reasonably brisk pace so that they are better able to understand an author's message because they can read the words in a connected way. But what we don't want principals and teachers to believe is that speed is what it is. That is, reading faster can sometimes be at the expense of comprehension. So we need that nice fluid reading style, but not at the expense of just going so fast. Yes, we need accuracy, which is where phonics comes in, which is where automatic recognition of high frequency words comes in. It does play an important part in supporting comprehension of text. Probably the penultimate skill in fluency is prosody. And by prosody, the research reminds us that it's about the lilt in the voice, it's the attention to the capitalisation, the punctuation, that question mark that says change your voice, and so on, that really makes for a richer reading of a piece of text. Again, all of these skills can be developed with deliberate, systematic teaching. It's not something that will automatically come to all students. Yes, we can think about some students who just seem to get it, but we can't assume and therefore leave students to work it out for themselves because some of them won't.